in advance for that. But really, just to start off with the EEF itself. So basically, we characterise ourselves as an organisation trying to address two different gaps. First of all, it's the evidence gap, trying to identify what works best in education in order to close the attainment gap, focusing on disadvantaged kids in relation to their peers. And that combination of mission and method is powerful. As you can see from the slide here, we've worked with half of schools in England so far, always welcoming more, of course. And 9 years in, we've just published our 100th RCT, and many of you will know what enormous pieces of work that those are as well. And our approach to evidence has really had three elements. First of all, generation, building the evidence base. Secondly, synthesis, drawing together and distilling the findings and the learning from that evidence. And then, of course, mobilisation and engaging the sector with this learning. So basically, we want to start with what we know, learn more, and then, crucially, support schools to use that evidence in practice. And I can't go on without, of course, just spending a moment to reflect on present issues, because, of course, our context is absolutely crucial. And the EEF have been focusing, as many of you will know, on the impact of the period of where schools have largely been closed, but now also going into this kind of middle phase of semi-opening and the impact on the likely gap growth for disadvantaged kids, as well as learning loss more broadly, of course. And what we've been trying to do, as well as analysing the likelihood of that learning loss and the growing gap, is really develop a response to the crisis around two elements in a framework. First of all, focusing on mitigation of that growing gap and the negative impact on disadvantaged kids while schools are largely closed. And then thinking about compensation in the second phase, helping to support disadvantaged pupils to bounce back during the phase of schools reopening. And of course, one of the things that we've been focused on there is thinking about catch-up, targeted approaches, especially aimed at supporting those who've fallen furthest behind during that period. Essential work, and I'm sure that you as a committee may be thinking of the opportunities for Oracy interventions there as well. So then segueing on to the issue of Oracy and oral language interventions. We've really found that these are hugely valuable at all stages of education, as you can see from the slide there. Again, I don't want to be too repetitious of what you already know, but basically interventions in this area tend to focus on, for example, targeted reading aloud and book discussion with young children, explicitly extending pupils' spoken vocabulary, use of structured questioning to develop reading comprehension, and the use of powerful curriculum-focused dialogue and interaction. And you can see also that I've tried to highlight the relationship, of course, with reflection, metacognition, and so forth. Now, again, I know that many of you will be very aware of our teaching and learning toolkit that highlights effect sizes of different interventions and approaches, and marrying them with progress, expected, value for money, and so forth. And you can see from this slide that our toolkit suggests a high level of progress indicated from Oracy interventions. I think that they typically have, this analysis has included the typical meta-analytical approaches. For example, comparing read aloud interventions with business as usual control groups and so forth. And just on the slide there, one of those bullets that I'd like to point out is the third one, Obviously, as you would expect, for the main part, this evidence seems to suggest that these interventions for oracy are measured against outcomes for literacy primarily. But we have also found in some cases indications for benefits in other subject areas as well. So a beneficial approach overall. And then I'll just spend a few moments going through the different sort of age groups in terms of sectors and learning. So first of all, starting with the early years, you can see the evidence here, and we have a specific early years toolkit focused on this age group, again showing the strong value and evidence base around the impact of communication and language approaches. And this is relatively consistent, suggesting that these approaches can be successful in a variety of different environments as well. A number of studies show the benefits of trained teaching assistants effectively supporting both oral language skills and reading outcomes. And we've recently released our analysis. You can see here I've used as an exemplar the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which shows good outcomes and progress, and is a good exemplar here, I think. And really, I guess, exemplifying that language provides the foundation of thinking and learning, so it's so important. The first recommendation in the EEF's Preparing for Literacy guidance report is that settings should prioritise the development of communication and language. And then moving quickly on to primary, again, you can see that we've developed a range of guidance reports here addressing both Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. Our own studies, including the study Dialogic Teaching, which again is exemplified on the slide for you here, show the promise in this regard. The dialogic teaching intervention aimed to improve pupil engagement and attainment by improving the quality of classroom talk. Teachers are trained in strategies that enable pupils to reason, discuss, argue and explain rather than merely respond in order to again develop that higher order thinking and articulacy. And schools made 2 months additional progress in English and science and 1 month's additional progress in maths compared to kids in control schools. So I think really showing the promise and the evidence here. And then in terms of secondary, again, high quality talk is typically well structured and guided by teachers. Teachers can support students by modelling that high quality talk, for example, including key vocabulary and metacognitive reflection. Many of you will be familiar with Lauren Resnick's accountable talk framework and so forth, which again has been shown very productive. And you can see from that bottom bullet point there as well that while all students benefit from classroom discussion activities, talk also appears to be particularly beneficial for low attaining students and those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So of course for the EEF as an organisation, this is very dear to our hearts and a really important finding. It wouldn't be right to finish without mentioning the importance of implementation. Throughout the meta-analysis in the EEF toolkit, we can clearly see the focus on things being done specifically and well with high fidelity, and that this is really important in terms of showing productive outcome. We know from the literature more broadly that implementation in schools is all. And without that high quality, that planning, that preparation, that monitoring and development, whole school buy-in, senior leadership team buy-in and so forth, that even the best interventions may be set up to fail. So that point is a really important takeaway, I think. And then just finally to illustrate an approach that we've been taking during the COVID crisis. we've been repackaging some of our evidence-based guidance reports, repackaging productive messages for schools and for schools to use with parents as well to support home learning. And we've included, of course, a focus here, and particularly in our guidance for early years and early primary, including this trust model that many of you may be familiar with. It's really a framework to support high quality interactions and talk, whether in school or in the home, of course. So I hope that that's been a whirlwind overview of the approach that the EEF has taken in generating research evidence and encouraging its uptake. But of course, focusing on the strong evidence for Oracy approaches right through the education system from the early years up into secondary, and highlighting, of course, also the importance of effective implementation. So I hope that's been a good start to the session. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that. I especially enjoyed the parts about early years, because it just reminded me of being in early years an infant teacher, and used to see the children playing in the sand and water, and they're sort of talking out loud to themselves when they're doing stuff, and it just brought back lots of lovely memories. I just wonder, with the evidence base being quite clear on the importance of Oracy, why don't you think it has a higher, or why doesn't it have a higher priority in government policy? What do you think the barriers might be?
I can't answer that straightforwardly, Emma. I think that perhaps it's been about promoting other priorities, if I can put it that way. But nevertheless, I think that the evidence is clear. Of course, Oracy isn't the only thing, and as you know, it's complementary with a lot of other important points, both for literacy and more broadly. But I think that hopefully I've illustrated that the evidence base is pretty clear, both nationally and internationally. So hopefully this lends you some support.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm joined by Lord Mike Watson and Marion Fellows MP. Would Mike or Marion like to ask Becky a question? You just need to unmute, Marion.
Not often you have to say that to me, Emma. It's really in terms of Oracy. Does it matter how the children speak? Because that's quite an important issue. If we expect them to speak properly, then it inhibits them. So do you think it's more important, do you agree with me that it's more important that children speak than exactly how they do it?
I think that that's a really, a very, very strong hypothesis, Marion. Again, I'm reticent to talk in more detail, given that there are many people on this call that will be able to answer much more fulsomely and accurately than me on this. Oracy is not my personal academic specialty, as you know, whereas there are many on this call for whom that is the case, and so they'll be able to answer better than me. But nevertheless, my understanding of the literature is that encouraging talk encourages reflection, and it's the structure of that learning. It's not just talk for its own sake, it's actually that guided conversation, including that metacognitive, reflective aspect that is so productive. Others can jump in or disagree with me if they feel that's not right, but that's my takeaway.
Thank you very much. Mike, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I'm showing us Gemma Carroll on your screen, which I regard as a great privilege. Oh, it's been changed now, thank you. A bit of a follow-up to Marion's question, actually, because I visited a school in London last year where, with a very high ethnic minority community, and the teachers were concentrated a lot on Oracy. One of the points they made was the fact that a lot of the young people talked almost their own patois when talking to themselves, and indeed in their families. And when teachers told them not to do that, some of them said, well, you know, you're challenging some of my cultural background by expecting me to speak the Queen's English, as it were. And the teachers made it clear that some of the teaching did take place in the language that the children themselves spoke day to day, but they made it clear that they had to have an alternative, particularly when it came to facing up to the world of work when it came. So I find that very interesting. But other schools I visited since have not really, well, certainly haven't understood, I don't think, what Oracy was and what its benefits were. And I noticed Professor Francis saying there that the effects of school closures are really exacerbating the situation. And I wonder how, at a time when resources are going to be even more stressed when things get back to anything approaching normal, it seems to me that investment in more teachers to allow Oracy to be spread within teaching is necessary. And that's surely going to be more difficult than ever. And I wonder if you have any ways or ideas at how it might be fed into the curriculum that this could be highlighted at a time when some children sadly will have fallen even further behind than they were 3 months ago.
I think those are really valuable points, Lord Watson, and a real challenge about this question about maintaining a broad and balanced curriculum in such challenging times. You know, logistically challenging, as well as all the points about learning loss and mental well-being and so forth. I think one of the ways that the EEF has been focusing is on really how can we help and how can we build capacity in these really difficult circumstances. And one of the things that we've been looking at is tuition, which is very well evidenced that, as you know, tends to be available to some students and not others. So we've been focusing at the EEF on developing a proposition around high quality tuition for disadvantaged kids, whether that's one-to-one or whether that's small group teaching. Very much guided by schools, because that's often one of the problems with poor quality tuition, that it's kind of low quality, privately purchased and not connected to what kids are doing in schools. And we've been thinking about both trained teachers as tutors, but also of the notion of qualified graduates supporting teachers and so forth to add capacity at this time. And I think one of the issues there is that, of course, with tuition, people tend to think about sort of subject specialist tuition for the older age group. And of course, that is important and has its place. But also there might be the opportunity to be supporting literacy and oracy, whether that is simply English language in the early years, for example, or whether it's English as an additional language even would be another proposition. So I think this thinking creatively about how to support kids to bounce back in this really strange mixed period that we're going to. I think we all thought, 6 weeks ago we might have thought post-COVID, but we can see that we're going to be in this interim phase for a long time, I think. So yes, we'll need all the creativity we can get, I feel.
Excuse me, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who is, it is a real honour to have Jean Gross with us today. And I had the pleasure of hearing her give evidence to the Education Select Committee and found myself nodding furiously along with every word she said. She's the former Communications and the chair of the Bercow 10 Years On inquiry. And I highly recommend anybody who hasn't had a chance to look at the 10 Year On inquiry to please do so, because it really is expert. So thank you so much, Jean, for making the time to join us today, and we really look forward to your comments. If I can encourage the people watching who I can't see, please do keep your comments coming in on the chat box and the Q&A, and we'll come to them right at the end after every presenter has given their presentation. But thank you very much, Jean. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's nice to talk to you again. I'm going to start with a little bit of the evidence of the links between oral language, oracy, and disadvantage. One of the seminal studies is what's called the Millennium Cohort, a study of thousands of children born at the millennium. And Marion, this was children in Scotland as well. It wasn't just English children, it was the whole of the UK. And that study, following those children up, found a huge gap in their vocabulary when they were 5 years old. And interestingly, that gap was bigger than the gap in other cognitive skills and bigger than the gap found in other developed countries. It's something we seem to have a particular issue or problem with. So that was age 5, but the gap goes on for school-age children with a much greater probability of being identified as having speech, language and communication needs, special needs in language, if you are eligible for free school meals. Lots of theories about why there's a link between language and disadvantage. Most of them come down to the idea that early conversations in the home, partly the number of words that families speak to their young child in the home up to the age of 4 or 5, but more recent evidence, not just the number of words, it's the interaction, the conversational exchange, the back and forth that really matters. That's, again, up to 5, but there are factors that happen in school that inadvertently compound the disadvantage gap. Some interesting research showing that if a teacher teaches in a poorer area, they kind of back off from, they don't want to, they don't mean to, but they back off from explaining the more complex words. They're less likely to expand children's vocabulary because they think, oh, that child won't know that word, let's just skate over it. And then there's the factor of pupil groupings, which I know Becky is very interested in. Children are often grouped from an early age in primary schools according to their reading ability. And very often disadvantaged children end up in a lower group with a mixture of other children who may have English as an additional language, some have special needs, some have behaviour problems. And that grouping may mean that those children don't have the mutual role models of other children's language because they're in fixed groups. Very often those groups have teaching assistants sitting with them. And we do have to face this tricky, really difficult issue that many disadvantaged schools in poor estates, serving poor areas, recruit their teaching assistants from their immediate community. And it is a hard fact, not universal, but very possible that those teaching assistants may themselves not have, not because of, you know, lack of intelligence, just their own life circumstances may mean that they have not been able to develop that rich vocabulary. So the children who most need it may spend less time with teachers and more time with teaching assistants. Some interesting research on independent versus state schools. This was done, Voice 21 initiated this fabulous survey of teachers, and you'll see that teachers in independent schools are much more likely to talk about oracy, to think it's important to talk to parents about their child's contribution in class, to have debating clubs. State schools do these things less, and we can talk about why later on. Will COVID-19 widen the gap? I think in language particularly, we know it's definitely going to widen the gap in other aspects of attainment. I think it will widen the language gap, partly because of what's happening in the early years. I've got a lot of evidence, anecdotal, that children from more affluent families with professional parents, those children's language, those young children's language has come on in leaps and bounds in the last 2 months because they have been exposed to a lot of adult conversation. They've been at home with their parents and they have gone from, you know, 2 words to sentences in a very short space of time. But if you are in a home in lockdown period where you're not having those conversations, then that won't be happening. So that could widen the gap. Second factor is that disadvantaged children, we know that there's evidence that attending nursery school, high quality early years provision can improve their language, and they haven't been in nursery settings in the last couple of months. There's variation in the extent to which schools have used online remote teaching. There's evidence that independent schools have tended to use more Zoom and Google Classrooms and so on. And it is those live lessons that have the potential for oracy. A great deal of oracy can happen in those lessons that doesn't when you just send a pack of worksheets home. And then finally, I think there are mental health issues that we'll reap the whirlwind of, that children with language needs, for whatever reason, are going to struggle to voice their feelings, to voice their anxieties, their worries, and to use language to self-regulate. And that may mean that we see increased mental health issues in children with language needs. I won't say much about the long-term consequences of weaker language skills, but this is just one study that may interest you, done by Professor James Law, who followed up 2 large groups of 5-year-olds until they were in their 30s. And one group had good language and good non-verbal skills, and the other group had a very particular language difficulties against a background of good non-verbal skills. That group who have poor language when they were 5, when they were in their 30s, they were twice as likely to be unemployed and 1.5 times more likely to have mental health needs. So the long-term consequences can be profound. Can we do anything about it? Can schools and work before schools make a difference? Becky's covered the evidence on this. There is a great deal of direct evidence that we can make a difference. So the Early Intervention Foundation and the Education Endowment Foundation have evidence on early years parent-child interaction programs where you try to improve the quality of parent-child interaction in disadvantaged families. ICANN have evaluated their nursery program, a small group teaching assistant program, good evaluation, very powerful evidence. There's a study of year 5 pupils, and that's that list at the end of the EEF's studies, which have showed an impact on language. Nellie, by the way, is the one Becky referred to, the Nuffield Early Language Intervention Schools. Love that you can call it Nellie. So we can make a difference. Are schools doing it? Well, I do have a lot of contact with schools, and my perception is they are doing more than they used to, because the tests at the end of, in England, when children are 11, now have huge demands on children's vocabulary and language comprehension. Similarly, GCSEs have, the GCSEs now have a huge demand across all subjects on children's vocabulary. So schools are very interested in vocabulary, but what they are doing, and I'm using here a model from Voice 21, I think what schools are doing is focusing on, sorry, go back, Oracy 4 learning, Oracy 4 literacy, maths, GCSEs. They're using it in an instrumental way. I'm not sure they're always focusing on oracy learning in its own right, recognizing that you don't just need oracy for other subjects. It is vital to employability, mental health, all sorts of other outcomes. So I'm not seeing the balance there. And I am seeing just to focus on vocabulary. A lot of schools are doing, not the ones working with Voice 21, but schools that just want to improve their test results. They have word of the day, word of the week, lots of work on vocabulary, not always recognizing that there's more to language than vocabulary. And to learn words, you need that supportive classroom context where language is constantly used in dialogic ways. This is what schools should have in place, and sometimes do, sometimes don't. They need that bottom layer of quality oracy in the classroom for all pupils. The better that is, the fewer children who then need the targeted small group interventions, like the ones Becky described, where it may be a teaching assistant works with them for 10 weeks to help them catch up. The better that layer is, the fewer children who then need specialist support. There always will be 7.6% of children who have a language need that isn't going to go away, and they need specialist support and are not always getting it at all, as we hear later. But there is this group here who can be caught up if schools put in those interventions. But all of those need the quality first teaching in classrooms to make it all work. I don't think schools will put that in place. I don't think they will without some fundamental policy changes. So I want to finish with my 5 recommendations of what I think might need to happen at government level if we are to see schools do what they want to do, but don't always manage to. I think the national curriculum needs to be revised in England so it includes a progression in what children should learn. What should they learn in language at 5, at 6, at 9, at 11, at 13? And that should be assessed. We don't assess language in schools oracy at all, and if it's not assessed, it won't be taught. And it is a bit there in Ofsted. The Bercow review tried to encourage and work with Ofsted to get it into Ofsted frameworks, but I'm not sure it's always a high profile in Ofsted inspections, so schools don't feel accountable for it. There's an opportunity, a new system in England for new teachers to have 2 years of extra professional development. That programme is being piloted this autumn, rolled out in 2021. It needs to have Oracy. I don't think we can build it all into initial teacher training. There isn't long enough. It's too short a course, a year for many teachers. But those extra 2 years would be a great time if we can check that those programmes do include Oracy. I think we could build on, there's government funded something called English Hubs, schools which are given money to support other schools. ICANN are working with Ruth Miskin Literacy to develop in some of those schools model classrooms that provide that expert language environment for all children. Model classrooms, then other schools can go and visit and look at it. So that's happening for 5-year-olds. Could we not do that for 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 14-year-olds? And finally, I think following the school closures, we need to look at extra tuition, catch-up tuition, not just in English and maths, but in language also, using evidence-based programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We've got lots of great questions coming in from the comments, so do please keep them coming. So the first question I've got from Tiffany is, how important is it to build knowledge of current affairs and to use current affairs content as stimulus for Oracy? It's just the context for the question is the Economist Education Foundation focuses on Oracy alongside news literacy to enable discussions about the news in and between schools. As the last few months of evidence, more than ever, current affairs have had a huge impact on disadvantage and social mobility. We believe we must support young people to develop the knowledge and skills required to form sound opinions on the news, as well as the confidence to speak up about the issues affecting them. So,
yes, I completely agree. Children learn anything better if it's relevant, and what's relevant to them is current affairs. So everything that's happening now, we should be talking about it, and work on helping children critically evaluate the news is part of that. And it's something that Voice 21 do so well with their schools, that children learn to debate, to discuss, to analyse, and not be taken in by things.
Brilliant. And another question coming in from the audience as well. Is from ICANN, and it says 10% of children have speech, language and communication needs. In areas of disadvantage, this rises to as many as 50%. How can we make sure schools have the specialist support and resources they need to tackle this challenge?
Yes, well, perhaps we could encourage them to use their pupil premium a little more for Oracy. Schools, there is money targeted at disadvantaged schools. It's perhaps not huge, but you know, a crazy idea would be a little boost to that, with a little nudge from government to say use it for Oracy. And the EF help with that. I know their evidence is very influential in schools, but nevertheless schools tend to fling that at catching a 10-year-old up with their reading rather than maybe getting in with a 5-year-old's Oracy.
Brilliant. And one question which is actually from me, which is more around the Oracy assessment and how workable you feel that could be, and how well supported it is amongst teaching profession. Because as having been a teacher myself, there are always 101 priorities at the same time. So how would that work?
It is hard. You don't want to add to the burden on already overburdened teachers, and any form of assessment, new assessment, is of course an additional burden. But for example, in GCSE English, there was once a mark given for a spoken presentation, and a few years ago that stopped being given. So that would be one simple way, is to bring back that mark into the grade you get. It's no longer contributes towards the grade. It's still there, but it doesn't contribute to the grade, and if it's not in the grade, nobody pays much attention to it. So that wouldn't necessarily add to workload, but I'd like to see the development of national sort of tools that could be used, observational tools to assess children's language. But yeah, we have to be careful about workload.
Thank you. Just before I move on, I don't know if Marion or Mike would like to ask a question now, or save it for later. Right, we'll save it for later. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jean. I'll introduce the next panellist. I'll just check the order that I'm doing this in, which is Roy Blatchford, who is from the Forgotten Third Commission. So I'm delighted that he's able to join us. He's worked in nearly every sector of education, from classroom all the way up to Whitehall. In the past 40 years, has been a teacher, a head teacher, a school governor, a government advisor, and a director of various educational charities, an Ofsted inspector, a national trainer, a government advisor, and a keynote speaker. So you name it, pretty much. I think Roy's pretty much done it. So very, very pleased to have you here joining us. Thank you so much, Roy.
Thank you for inviting me. Am I unmuted? Is that all right? Pleasure to be with you, particularly to follow from Becky and Jean. And of course, as these little seminars develop, you realise that all you're about to say has almost already been said. So I'll try and cut to the chase. The title of my presentation is The Forgotten Third. I just want to say a few words about the dignity of articulacy, and I've chosen those two words deliberately, and then 4 sections from the Forgotten Third report. First, by way of the dignity of articulacy, I began as a teacher teaching in HM Prison Brixton, and almost all the young men I met in the prison when I was teaching in the evenings, they had one thing in common. They had stuttering and fractured literacy and articulacy. And I used to hypothesize that, and indeed was true, that faced with an opposing view on a Saturday night, instead of arguing back with confidence, persuasion and fluency, these young men had picked up a bottle and put it through someone's face. In other words, they knew no other way. Words were not at their command. And when I then started teaching 11-year-olds in a Brixton primary school, I vowed to myself that whatever else I might do as a teacher, I would give the children the dignity of being able to speak, read and write with fluency. And treating one another with dignity is, after all, what makes us human. 25 years later, when I worked at the National Literacy Trust, I used to give a talk titled, "Have you ever met a mugger who has read Middlemarch?" And this belief that I have that basic literacy and articulacy are a birthright really has been a guiding light for me throughout my career. And over the past 15 years, I've been in over 15,000 classrooms all over the world, from early years to higher education. And I am well known for saying to children and young people, subject to their cultural sensitivities, speak to me with your eyes. And we all must have met children who lower their eyes when they're speaking and need to speak to you with their eyes, recognizing cultural sensitivities. So that by way of the introduction of the dignity of articulacy, and I want to come back to both of those words, because oracy is the title. I want to shift the vocabulary and talk about articulacy as well. Last year I was invited to chair a national commission for the Association of School and College Leaders, ASCL, called The Forgotten Third. And the focus was on the third of 16-year-olds, that's about 190,000 last year, who each summer do not achieve a standard pass grade 4 in GCSE English and Maths. And of course, it will be the same this year, rooted in comparable outcomes and centre assessed gradings. There still will be a forgotten third. And thus, at the end of 12 years of compulsory education in this wealthy democracy of ours, a third of 16-year-olds have to fail for 2/3 to pass. And fail would be if you get a grade 1, 2 or 3. And when you ask children, young people at 17, if they've got a 1, 2 or 3 grade, they say I failed. Now my international colleagues ask me, why do you do this? Well, why would you? And we are almost alone, Becky will know, as a nation in creating this perceived failure rate at 16 plus. Jeff Barton, the General Secretary of ASCL, has spoken about this quite a lot. And what does this failure rate do for young people's self-esteem and dignity? And I think it's a sharp question in the context of a government rightly committed to levelling up. Well, for the forgotten third, our national evidence gathering, it's all in the report, you can see the detail, but from schools and colleges around the country, meeting thousands of teachers, listening to students, particularly students in FE college who had failed, and they're doing the resits, and we know then again only 20% of the resits succeed. We sought to answer some of the questions, came up with some solutions. Some are doable by tweaking current provision. Jean mentioned a few. Some need fundamental change in our accountability system. I might just in parentheses here say be careful what you wish for. 2020, no Ofsted, no written exams, no league tables, no SATs, no Progress 8 measures, gone in a sweep. So let's not waste the opportunity presented. You have the full report, the committee can have the full report, but I'm just going to cut to the chase on 4 headings. The Forgotten Third report has 14 recommendations under these 4 headings. The promotion of oracy and articulacy run through the recommendations, if you like Brighton through a stick of rock. But for today's purposes, I've picked out only those recommendations which relate directly to speaking and listening in schools. And I remember Peter Hyman saying, giving it the term oracy maybe just gives it a little bit of a twist, a bit of a difference so people will sit up. Maybe that's why I use articulacy, and maybe that's why I use dignity. Anyway, there are 4 sections. In early years, Jean's mentioned, really interestingly, Jean, a thought about TA's language, without dwelling on that. But we recommend, a key recommendation for early years, it should be graduate-led, ideally with practitioners having trained expertise in language development. As an inspector, I see too many early years settings where the promotion of systematic oracy suffers from benign neglect. And in my ideal world, from working around the world, all early years settings would be explicitly bilingual. Secondly, in relation to classrooms and curriculum, there are a number of recommendations. The 3 that I'll single out for this particular occasion. We recommend that schools should provide training in English for speakers of other languages, that's ESOL, for all teachers and support staff. And my international experience tells me that in classrooms all over the world, how English is being taught as a second language has much to teach us here in the UK as how we should teach our first language. Second recommendation, Jean's alluded to it, was very much around revising Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 continuity. There's a breakage there which is not satisfactory, with a focus on language. Jean's already mentioned the English hubs as a possible way to do that. And we also recommended, quote, primary and secondary schools should consider how to implement whole school programs like Voice 21, which, quote, explicitly, important this, explicitly promote oracy and articulacy as the essential stepping stones which underpin children's learning in all subjects. There's that word articulacy again, and the word explicitly. And in our evidence gathering in classrooms, we saw too much oracy, which was development, if you like, left to chance. So it's the explicit teaching of it, which I think is crucial in this context. Thirdly, teacher education. Well, many of us have been around the system a good few years. We recommend, echoing the Bullock report from 1975, that the profession genuinely adopts the concept and practice, quote, that every teacher in every classroom is a teacher of the English language. And that has eluded us, colleagues, for 45 years. It's eluded us. We have not persuaded the average good design and technology geography teacher that actually language is part of their métier. Fourthly, qualifications. There are many recommendations, but we recommend particularly, and Jean already has picked it up, a radical reform of GCSE English language and in maths, in fact, and we turn it into a passport, which is criteria referenced. It comprises online assessment, how useful that would have been this year, and we say a significant oracy component of 25%. Needs thinking through, but Jean's right, if you don't examine it, sadly in our system, it won't get examined. So what I've presented there, colleagues, I hope in the time available, is the recommendations relating to speaking and listening from a report which focused on the forgotten third. I remind you that's 190,000 youngsters in this year's cohort, last year's, the following years. And all of those youngsters have in common that after 12 years of investment, they fail to get a grade 4 in English and maths. And at the heart of their underachievement, our commission came to the view, and we heard from a range of evidence, of course, we believe that their stuttering literacy and their sad inarticulacy are a reflection very often of their inability to get those grade 4 grades. And thus, I think for us, in conclusion, as policy leaders and influencers, Emma, we need to do differently with oracy in primary and secondary classrooms in all subjects. And doing differently, I watch a lot of classrooms, is a very big challenge. Finally, a postscript from me. It would need explaining. I think I'm right in saying, Jean, it was 2011, was it, that there was a national year of speech and communication? I was involved with David Blunkett in the National Year of Reading. Why doesn't the Working Party say we should have a national year of oracy in 2021, which would, in a sense, pick up a lot of there's always being said about this gap that has emerged in recent months. Articulacy, finally. Jean, interestingly, had a slide on independent and state schools. Articulacy is not a word on many teachers' lips. And explicit oracy eludes most teachers. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that. We've had a few questions and comments come in on the chat, so I'm just going to mention them. We've had a comment from Walter, which is picking up on Marion Fellow's question about how children speak. Now, I know that fluency has been removed from the oracy framework, which I think is one of the things Walter mentions, but he also mentions about what proactive support can be provided for children who are inherently disfluent for developmental reasons such as stammering, and whom oracy could otherwise have a stressful, counterproductive impact, and what role could teachers play in this?
Well, just picking up, if I may, and Becky, or Jean may want to come back. I think what's been very interesting in the schools that I've watched over the past 2 months is that many of the vulnerable children, particularly perhaps with language challenges, who've been attending in small classes, have been the beneficiaries of that small group teaching. And I just wonder, budgets permitting, whether one of the key legacies of this period will be a refreshed look at how vulnerable learners, children with language difficulties, what they need by way of teaching in smaller groups. I think it'll be very interesting to watch as a legacy of the current period.
Thank you. Just on that point, before I turn to you, Roy, do you want to just come in on that, Jean?
I was just on the disfluency issues, and does emphasis on oracy in classrooms disadvantage children who stammer, for example? I think there's 2 things really, that there's ways of doing oracy in classrooms that don't put children on the spot. So, for example, they have a chance to chat informally to a peer before they're asked to say anything out loud to somebody else. And secondly, I'm reminded I've been teaching some Zoom lessons myself to a group of Year 6s, and this was not about disfluency, it was about the perils of the internet. So many children, their voice broke up, you couldn't hear them. So we just said, chat it, use the chat function instead. So I think I've learned a great deal about the possibility of using that function. And maybe that's, so if a child can't say it, write it down instead. They're still using the words in their head, even if they do end up writing it down. We find other ways to take the pressure off them, but it's an interesting point.
Both so much. Just back to you on that one, Roy. What's the government's response been so far to the Forgotten Thirds recommendations?
Well, I think it's been interesting that we've seen the very vocabulary of the Forgotten Third picked up within the DFE. I think we've been pushing at an open door with a number of the recommendations. I haven't mentioned in detail, but the resit industry. The resit industry at 16+ in FE colleges really is a terrible waste of students' time, resources and money, and it's quite clear that government is going to respond to that. I'm really confident that there's an open door there. I think there's an open door around the unfortunate language of a standard and a good pass. I think the DFE is very keen to try and ditch that. And of course, I think coming out of this, when we have no exams, as we hitherto know, there's an opportunity, I think, for us to look afresh at how we do GCSE, an examination that was introduced to show how students, what they can do. And in fact, a third of them are told what they can't do. Our key recommendation around online learning, coursework, and particularly valuing speaking and listening, I think really is something that should be a high profile when the GCSE English language is revised.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that, Roy. We might come back to comments right at the end from everybody, if that's okay. I want to move on now to, if I get my piece of paper right, Professor Sonia Blanford, who's from Achievement for All. Delighted you can join us. She's done excellent work on social mobility and is the author of the influential publication Born to Fail: Social Mobility and the Working Class. So Sonia is a visiting professor at the Education at the UCL and the Institute of Education, has held leadership positions in schools, higher education and charities as well. So I'm really pleased, I can't see you on my screen, Sonia, but I'm sure you are there. I'm really pleased that you can join us today and look forward to your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Just a little bit about Achievement for All. So we're an organisation that was created by the response to the Lamb inquiry in 2009. We are now over 10 years old in terms of the delivery. We've worked with 5,000 schools, including early years settings as well across the country. And recently we've also worked in post-16 settings. There are two areas that I'd like to bring to this debate, this conversation. One is the engagement of parents and carers. There's been a huge amount of pressure on parents and carers during COVID-19. The partnership with teachers is something that we have been working on since 2009, and the way in which parents and carers from all backgrounds can engage in their child's learning. So as I go through this, and I'm the opposite to Roy, I've got many slides, but as we go through the presentation, I want to emphasise the importance of parents and carers in their child's learning, particularly around oracy, language, in terms of literacy, in terms of understanding of all subjects, as has been mentioned already. So the way that we work at Achievement for All is that we have a team of 120 coaches. They engage with teachers and leaders. They also engage with parents and carers to improve outcomes for children and young people. We work with 2-year-olds through to now 24-year-olds more recently. So if we go to slide 2. In slide 2, I've just repeated the purpose of today. If you look at the bottom there, what I'm proposing is to go through what I see the issues as a consequence of where we are currently with COVID-19, but also to look at solutions and then the impact of the solution. So we go to the next slide. There's a real emphasis in the Bercow report, and I say this because I have the utmost respect for Jean and all the work that Jean and her colleagues have done. There's a real emphasis in terms of collaboration, in terms of working in partnership with other organisations in order to increase oracy. And I think that is something that we've got to take forward. If we go to the next page, there's also an emphasis in the work of the APPG on early years, and we've heard that mentioned already. The focus of early years, and that really brings to the fore the relationship with parents and carers. So if we go to the next slide, this is very much evidence-based. So everything that we're talking about, we're often criticised because we're a delivery organisation that we don't use evidence. We absolutely, throughout our development of our programmes and the delivery of our programmes, everything we do is evidence-based, whether that be through engagement with the parents and carers, engagement with teachers, or engagement with previous studies and other literacy. So there's an example there as we go through. At the bottom, last Friday, we had a repeat of some information that came out about the education, health and care plans focused on special educational needs and the provision for special educational needs. And one of the things that was at the forefront of that was, again, an emphasis of engagement with parents, the importance of co-production, the engagement of parents and carers in their child's learning, and the way in which, when a child has a need, that parents and carers have that voice. We go to the next slide. There's been a lot of literacy that's come out, a lot of research over the last 3-4 weeks about the issues around the COVID-19. At Achievement for All, we've also been working with schools in South Korea, and South Korea happens to be about 8 or 9 weeks ahead of us in terms of the impact of COVID-19. What is an absolute fundamental common thread running through this is the arrangements that have been made. If we go to the next slide, the arrangements that have been made, we go to the next slide, please. If we go to the arrangements that have been made at policy level to support those children and their families. Now, we've had a really good voice in terms of parental engagement. We've had a very good voice with Brian Lamb and the Lamb Inquiry. When Michael Gove was first Secretary of State, he was particularly committed to parents and carers engagement. Edward Timpson, when he was Minister for Children and Families, he again was particularly involved with promoting parents and carers engagement, and particularly around language and oracy. Nadim Sahawi and Robert Halfran at the 2018 Conservative Party conference, they were committed. We've had commitment from the House of Lords. And recently with the SEND review, the Special Educational Needs and Disability Review, we've had Tony McArdle leading on how schools can engage with parents and how that can be improved as we move forward into the next iteration of the Education, Care and Health Plan. So if we move to the next slide, as recently as yesterday, we've had a report come out from McKinsey. And what I want to focus on in this slide is the difference. The difference between what's happening in many countries and the difference is what's happening in regions within countries, and the difference that's been happening in terms of the provision, in terms of those children from disadvantaged backgrounds who have a lack of access to technology or expertise. So as we move forward to what will be an ongoing COVID-19 situation, we can't talk about pre, current and post, it is going to be ongoing. It's how we use technology and have technology available that is really, really difficult for a number of disadvantaged families, a significant number of disadvantaged families. And it can be as close as one child in a street to their neighbouring child, and the way in which families are able to access technology as we go forward. So if we're looking at engaging with families, looking at engaging with parents, we have to think about the technology and what's there to support children. So move to the next slide. We know that there has been a significant impact on children's progress. We know that COVID-19 is going to have an impact. There'll be all sorts of issues, which I'll come on to in a little bit more detail later. But the impact at Key Stage 4, back in 2014, Impetus produced a report on those not in employment, education and training. And there was a missing, Roy talked about 119,000 children per year in terms of examinations. They talked about the missing million aged between 16 and 24. That missing million are still likely to be, it's still likely to be the case. Here we are in 2021. And what we're facing is that link between home, school and the child, and particularly at Key Stage 4, the impact of COVID-19. Moving to the next slide, please. So we have a complex challenge in terms of the inequalities of remote learning. We have a complex challenge in terms of low-income students, immigrant students. We have a complex challenge in terms of rural and coastal areas. And if we're looking at the detail here, if we go to the next slide, resonates with the Bercow. If we go to the next slide, please. Resonates, and sorry about the size of this, but I thought that all of these were really important, and if these are going to be circulated. We need to look at how we can resolve the solution. And I think a solution is how we manage pupil premium going forward, how we introduce or reintroduce the pupil premium post or during that COVID-19 response. So if we go to the next. So pupil premium is the solution, or is part of the solution. We also know that pupil premium children are not all the same. That pupil premium children, if we look at the eligibility for free school meals, some children and young people have been in qualifying positions, and some have been in that position of pupil premium the whole of their school lives. The length of the time that they've received free school meals, that pupil premium is attracted to them, is quite significant. If we can go to the next slide. So Data Lab, and that's supported by the Education Policy Institute. If you look at that bottom wave that indicates children on free school meals that have had for 90% to 100% of their education, they've been on free school meals. They have been in decline in terms of their education outcomes. And part of that has been the way in which they've engaged in the classrooms. And I think the way that both Roy and Jean particularly emphasise what's happening in the classrooms, but it also impacts on what's happening at home. So there have been, if we go to the next slide, there have been real improvements in school delivery. But one of the things we're not doing is we're not addressing those with the most needs. So this is why at Achievement for we're making a thrust for well-being, because we feel that the environment that children are in, and it's been alluded to in some of the presentations today, that actually the environment that a child finds themselves in, it's really, really impacting on a child's learning, and particularly around oracy, we've heard that as well. So we have to think about what we're going to do with the pupil premium and how we're going to address that second bullet point, the trauma of COVID-19, because some of the changes that have happened over the last 5, 6, 7 years will have been lost because of the time away from school and because of the lack of coordination with the work with parents. So if we go to the next slide, please. So if we're looking at those changes, it is actually life chances and opportunities. And although I'm going to go on to focus very briefly on early years, it is early years, school oracy, post-16 oracy, and workplace oracy. We're doing a lot of work at the moment with Warburton's, the bread makers in Bolton. And we know that there are areas of deprivation in Greater Manchester that have been particularly hit by COVID-19. That's reported on a daily basis. But what we also know is that in that part of the world, there's been absolute deprivation around workplace oracy. And one of the things that we've been working with Warburton's is to improve parental understanding of the way that they communicate and the way that they interact with their children. So we move to the next slide, please. So we know that children with speech, communication and language needs, there's huge issues, and we know that there's going to be an impact. And the APPG has been asking these questions. So this comes from your documentation. If we go to the next slide, please. So just pausing on this slide. If we have children in this country that are going to be limited by oracy education that they receive and the oracy development they receive at home, then there's a lot of associated special needs that that can be have a causal effect or a linked effect. So this is research that we've been doing for our online community through the bubble. And we know that there are absolute causal links between each of these areas, whether we're talking about autism, whether we're talking about behavioural and emotional developments, whether we're talking about ADHD or dyspraxia and dyslexia. There's a huge amount of overlap. And although I'm not going to be as dramatic as Roy in terms of the opening phrase about his work in Brixton around stuttering and language development. We are currently working at Achievement for All with 92 local authorities with young offenders. And if we look at these particular needs and the needs around speech, language and communication, again, we're currently examining that relationship between speech, language, communication and other needs for those young people that find themselves either on a community licence or in some form of young offenders institution. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we are looking at the value and impact of Oracy. And we're looking around what happens in education through partnership with parents and also in terms of the way in which the pupil premium can be used. So these questions that came from APBG, we absolutely have at the heart of our work. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm going to pause on this. So this is a study that we've done in 58 settings from 2017 to 2019. So we were looking at speaking and language, speech, language and communication around the early years settings, where the baseline for these children from the disadvantaged groups was 17% in terms of their understanding against the early years standards. We engaged with the teachers, we engaged with the parents, we engaged with the young people, and the baseline at the start of that programme in 2017 was 17% of those children were meeting the national expectation. By the end of 2 years through that engagement, there was an improvement, a significant improvement, whereby 55% were improving. And the key to it was time to talk. The key to it was time to talk, was to working with parents as to how they would talk to their children. We've heard about teaching assistants, working with other practitioners, working with the way in which teachers and the early years settings, whether that be school or other mainstream settings, how they worked with oracy and language. So this supports many of the points I think that have been raised earlier. If we have a real issue with oracy, it can be resolved with time to talk and engaging with parents. If we go to the next slide, please, we're nearly there. So we know that oracy education has a role in tackling disadvantage. We know that the education system at the moment is not tackling that disadvantage in a way that's going to be sustainable, whether it's environmental or whether it is deliverable in schools. In the research that I did with Social Mobility Chance or Choice, I worked with 43 leaders across the country, from business, from education, and from social groups. And the common word that came through was that there needed to be a mutual understanding. So at the start of this consultation, Becky was asked the question around, is it about received pronunciation? Is it around English and language? Is it about a particular type of language? And one of the things that came out as a concern from many people was, how do we view the way people talk to each other? How do we view language? How do we engage with language? And what was important was mutuality, is understanding the values, understanding what everybody brings to the conversation, irrespective of their background, challenge or need. So if we move to the next slide, please. So 3 words that we often talk about at Achievement for All are aspiration, access and achievement. So we believe that we need to have a way of addressing the inequalities and the impact of school closures. But we also need to have a long-term commitment to all parents and carers to have the opportunity to be supported in a mutual valued way. We've already heard about the Nelly work with Oxford University, about the work of EEF. We also know that we have a fundamental right to support parents and carers as we move forward. So our aspiration would be that all parents and carers would have that opportunity. In terms of access, We want to have everybody to have the opportunity to be educated. And we really have to pick up on the use of technology, really important, about whether or not we have access to technology for every child in every home. And at the moment, that is clearly not the case. So in South Korea, it's something they've worked on for at least 10 years. And so therefore, they've been able to address some of the COVID-19 challenges in a lot clearer way and a lot more coherent way than we have through the use of technology. Achievement. We need to know that children can succeed regardless of their background, their challenge, or their need. We need to bring them together. We need all children to be able to talk to each other. And just finally, if we just go through the final 2-3 slides, we have got examples of what's been happening in Cheshire East and Cheshire West, and the way that parents have been able to engage with their children in a more positive way over recent months, because they have had that engagement, because they have had that confidence and that aspiration and be able to access what they need, and also to develop achievement in their children. I've already mentioned Warburton's. Just to say that a recent report from Education and Training Foundation also emphasises much the same. So just to sum up, if we just go to the final couple of slides, the next slide. Thank you for listening. You won't have had the opportunity to read through all the slides. Essentially, 3 messages. If we're going to have aspiration for every child, then we need to have parents and carers on board. How do we do that? We need to be able to work in partnership, but that needs to be structured. So that needs investment through the pupil premium. Secondly, access, technology. When we're looking at going forward, we need to have an understanding of what's happening in families, and we need to have an understanding of how to develop the use of technology in whatever form going forward. And then finally, in terms of achievement, I haven't gone into the detail, partly because of time, in the way that Roy did and talked about assessment. Achievement, we need to look at what does achievement actually mean for us all. But whatever we mean in terms of speech, language, in terms of education per se, we need to have equal access for every child in our schools, early years and post-16 settings. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for tolerating the number of slides, and I'll explain why I use them at the end. Some people have heard me say this. My mother was illiterate. My father only learnt to read in the army. We didn't have books at home. I'm quite mature now, but Born to Fail was based on a study that I was one of the children in the Born to Fail study. And we were identified as children who, those born in 1958, in a particular time, that we would fail, that we were born to fail. And that study was produced and published in 1973. I don't think we should be responsible for a society here in England, whether it's England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, where children are born to fail. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sonia. I'm conscious of time and aware that people's time is running out, so I'm not going to ask any questions directly to you. What I am going to do is move on to the next speaker, but I am going to ask every panelist if they're okay to just final thoughts right at the end, sort of comments. So I'm moving on to Alice Barnard, who's the Chief Executive of the Edge Foundation. Now, me and Alice have been chatting throughout this pandemic because I've been working really closely with the Edge Foundation on just the point that Sonia mentioned near the end there, which was looking at supplying IT equipment and what can be done to support learners at home. So it is a real pleasure to see you back again, Alice. I feel like I know your kitchen very well. So delighted to have you here and look forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Emma, and great to see so many participants today. My take on this is going to be slightly different, I think, to the other panelists. The Edge Foundation is a non-politically lined think tank. We're interested in both thinking and doing, and our latest strapline is that we want to make education real and relevant. And I was delighted to be able to contribute to today's session. I guess for us, Oracy is part of a part of a wide spectrum of activities that we're interested in education. And it made me really spend some time thinking about how important this is and where it sits broadly in education terms. So I went back to the beginning and started to think about oracy and the word itself. So oracy being the ability to express oneself fluently. Interesting. It's also interesting that we use the word oracy with its roots in deeply entrenched in Old French and Latin, and its connotations with ancient Greeks and early democracy. Most people probably from the business world would consider this in the broader terms of communication. And I think, having seen some of the comments that have popped up during the time that we've been on this call, that there is some debate around the terminology. And having had a number of meetings at the DFE over the last 4.5 years while I've been the Chief Executive of the Edge Foundation, it's interesting to see how deeply entrenched some of the special advisors are in the department around the whole trads versus the progressives, and if you want to flex the system, that somehow this is the start of a revolution. And what I noticed when I was with one particular special advisor is when you talked about oracy, he relaxed and became much more engaged. And it was because he'd had a meeting recently with Voice 21, who'd been in and explained how important oracy was in a child's growth and their education and learning. And it was almost like it had flicked a switch in his mind. And one wonders if that's why sort of Nick Gibb has been maybe slightly more flexible around this area than he has been with his very knowledge-led curriculum that actually squeezes out a lot of the subjects that allow young people to be confident and articulate and think about themselves and the context in which they're learning in. I guess my concern is that in a system where we rely on rote learning, it's heavily knowledge-led, that learning, as it were, oracy, is seen as an extra and nice to have, when actually it should be integrated as part of every aspect of a young person's teaching and learning. And that's very much been the case, I think, of all the speakers up to now, that although some feel it should have its own identity, that we actually all believe that this isn't just a question of a subject standing alone, that you should be able to embed this in everything from geography to maths, that actually communication is at the heart of every human activity. And I think some of this has perhaps been exemplified in work that we've carried out in the last week, and a piece of really interesting polling. We found that 92% of parents and 96% of teachers wanted young people to develop a range of skills, including critical thinking, problem solving, and communication. And a further 86% of parents and 96% of teachers agreed that education should develop values in children like kindness, empathy, and social cohesion. And this was all off the back of the initial question that we asked, which was, do you agree that teaching and education needs to be overhauled following COVID-19, of which 66% of parents and 78% of teachers agreed. And I think we have an opportunity here, and I think it was something that Roy said, to really shake things up. And our reflection is that businesses have long been saying that qualifications are only part of the process of building a talent pipeline of young people. That yes, qualifications help to stipulate a young person's achievement, but actually what really matters is understanding the young person's aptitude and their attitude. And I think that from their perspective, it's long been the fact that good communication, the ability to make good eye contact, the ability to be able to find good examples of why you are good at something is actually, and I think it goes back to that point about articulate. If they're able to articulate those experiences, it really helps an employer to identify the type of young person they might want to employ. And having done quite a lot of media interviews this week off the back of those YouGov statistics, I've been asked repeatedly about the status of exams. And I think, as a number of other speakers have said, the fact that we haven't had A-levels and GCSEs this year, the fact that we've asked teachers to make broader assessments of how young people have performed beyond simply examination results, whether that's internal or external, looking at the whole person and how they performed in lessons, how they performed with their peers, as well as how they performed in their schoolwork. So yes, I think this is an opportunity to really consider the way in which young people are assessed. And we had the good fortune to visit a school in the US, which has a really interesting and rigorous way of assessing young people at the end of their kind of project work. And I'm going to read you a tiny bit from a blog that was posted on our website. A young woman steps up to the podium to give a presentation. So far, this could be any seminar in any high school, but this is a presentation with a real difference. The first difference is the content. It's a presentation about a particular assignment or individual piece of work. This is a portfolio defense, a detailed and thorough presentation about the student's final year of work at the school. She begins by talking openly about her personal development, outlining how she has changed as a person over the past year and over her time in school. She then brings in 3 artifacts for considerations, detailed pieces of subject work from a variety of different disciplines, from persuasive writing in English literature to a look at the impact of Roe versus Wade on the abortion law in the US historical and in the present. What matters about all these artifacts is that she is not showing off just her academic knowledge in these areas, but rather focusing on the specific skills that she has developed from these pieces of work. Taking it further, she demonstrates how she has transferred these skills not only from one subject to another, but from school to the other persuasive, from school to, so sorry, lost my space. From school to the other aspects of her life. For instance, using the persuasive writing she's developed in English to support voluntary work with young people in custody. She concludes by applying all of this to her plans for the future to set out how her knowledge and skills help her building towards her chosen career path. We often talk about the rigour in education system, and in England that has become synonymous with the cycles of education debate with traditional exams that we require a high degree of knowledge for. But do we really need to test or develop those skills? It is difficult to see how this approach, detailed above, could not be carefully constructed, argued and tested in front of authentic audiences, and this could not be described as anything but rigorous. What we love about this approach is that it really takes a holistic view of the young person, helping them to bring together the knowledge, skills and behaviours they've learned both in school and outside, and focusing on the person they want to become. It also fits closely with the new trend in education towards a focus on metacognition, helping young people to not just learn facts by rote, but to deeply understand how they learn and develop patterns and techniques that will be applied in a whole variety of different scenarios. So I think in conclusion on that point, there's a real opportunity here to challenge the status quo. And on the point of GCSEs, Lord Baker, my former boss, in January of last year, some would say controversially, challenged the fact that GCSEs still had a place in the education system. And as the man that introduced him, I think there was heavy weight behind revisiting whether or not they are still fit for purpose. So we have seen many organisations that have stepped up to the challenge of supporting Oracy in school, and Voice 21 has been mentioned several times, and they're an organisation that we've worked really closely with as part of our wider work in making education real and relevant. And it's excellent to see the work they put in to developing teachers. And after all, teachers as I suppose the conduit to young people of knowledge, it makes sense that we help them be the best and most articulate they can. But as one of the other speakers mentioned, it also challenges how teacher training is also structured and delivered. Is this a gap that can be filled, or is it that teacher training is already so crowded with so many activities that this can't be added to it? I think also it was mentioned by another speaker that you do get what you measure. And with the obsession around EBAC, Progress 8, the number of students that are going to university, the way in which young people articulate, the way in which they communicate, becomes a nice to have, not one that is prioritised. And this led me on to thinking about why is oracy or communication sometimes challenging for some young people. And it struck me that actually confidence is one of the most important attributes to help young people to be able to become more articulate and to deliver their communication in a way that's appealing and listened to by others. And I was struck particularly when I went to a school that we work closely with in Doncaster called XP. Their curriculum is all delivered through expeditionary learning, where they have large, powerful guided questions, and young people are expected to be able to self-direct their learning. The school is on a lottery intake and serves a community that is socially and economically deprived. And yet the young people I met were confident, articulate, happy, and wanted to talk to anyone and everyone that came into their school about not just their experience with their peers, but also what they learned and how they learned. And it was really interesting to see how that deep-seated confidence was directly translated into their ability to talk very openly about their learning. And it also seemed to drive their curiosity, and it also seemed to increase their ability to interrogate things they were told or read. School, XP School is unique and it's a small school, but all the way in which it delivers its teaching and learning all can exist within the existing frameworks. So there's some very exciting things going on there that we could perhaps look at spreading throughout other schools that are interested in developing this. And one of the other speakers mentioned this about post-COVID communication. Life has changed. We are, for example, today doing this by Zoom, that we are all communicating in a different way. And that has its challenges. By not being together at times, communication can get lost, can get confused. There is different etiquette that we have to pursue. And this is going to be part of whatever world that we're going to be going back to. So I think it's important that young people are guided through that process. Going back to a point I raised earlier around the current knowledge-led curriculum, I think where we are at the moment with the current government's obsession about heavily EBAC related subjects dominating the curriculum, it actually prevents the development of the subjects that really embed confidence and creative elements. So those subjects that help young people express themselves, like music, dance, art, design and technology, all subjects that help young people understand how to express themselves, both through words and through movements. And it seems to me that the current curriculum increases young people's fear of failure, which I think was touched on by another speaker. We all make mistakes, and when you talk, and if it's natural, then you're not always going to do your best, or not. You might try to do your best, but you may not always deliver at your best. And I think it's important that young people realise that they're able to make those mistakes and they're able to develop these skills, and that they don't instantly happen overnight, and that it's a question of understanding, practicing and being nurtured until you become confident about your delivery. And in the last part of what I wanted to cover off was that for us, Oracy is part of a broad number of activities that we should be visiting and revisiting, encouraging government and policymakers to look at. In itself, it shouldn't be made the sticking plaster. It should be fully integrated. And as we look to linear exams that take out coursework, and as we look at even science being removed in terms of the science experiments being removed from the curriculum, surely now is the time, I think, as Roy said, where we potentially can really agitate the system. It was also brought up by another speaker about the independent schools versus state schools, and I think I would echo the thoughts around that in independent schools, there's a real mentality around spoken communication, debating and drama, and there's lots of reasons why they have the time, space and money to be able to do that. Government is always calling on state schools to replicate what the independent sector does, but then spends most of its time paralysing it from doing any of those things. What we have noticed, and what is interesting, is that careers, advice, information and guidance can often also enhance and increase young people's engagement with communication, the opportunity to be talking to other adults other than their teachers, particularly for young people who may not have that much interaction in their home life. It's an opportunity to spend some time with adults that are interested in them and who they are interested in improving eye contact, improving questioning, interrogating the information they are receiving. Ultimately, oracy, communication, articulation, these are all elements that are really driven by an element of social capital. And while the Edge Foundation doesn't specialise in any way on those learners who are particularly struggling to engage in education, it seems to us that social mobility is a key part of the success of young people, and that is largely driven by their ability to communicate, and especially in the workplace, to be able to sell themselves to employers of the future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alison. I'm conscious of time, and I've seen Becky's unfortunately got to leave, but thank you so much for your time, Becky, as well. Really appreciate it. I hate doing this to you, Harriet, but if it would be possible, if you could condense it a little bit, we'd be really grateful. But thank you so much for joining us. Harriet Waldegrave is from the Office of the Children's Commissioner, Senior Public Affairs and Policy Analyst at the Office of the Children's Commissioner, and prior to that's worked as a social worker and an Education Research Fellow at Policy Exchange. And we're so pleased you'll be here. And thank you for your patience for waiting such a long time to give your contribution. And apologies again for cutting you a little bit short, but thank you. Welcome.
Not at all. It's delightful to be here, and I mean, hard to add much to all the brilliant things that have already been said. I suppose I wanted to bring up a little bit about our research on speech and language therapy, although obviously sort of not directly about oracy education. I think really closely related, as we've said, for those children who might need additional support to access oracy education, but also for those who are struggling more. I think the Children's Commissioner's perspective on this is, of course, around the education attainment gap and employment outcomes, but particularly around sort of the social gap, as others have brought up, the long-term impact on mental health, children in custody, in care, in need. I think we've all seen that cycle of having difficulties communicating can lead to serious frustrations, presenting as challenging behaviour, and can, for some children, start kind of a cycle that really sadly for some can end up in exploitation or involvement in criminal justice systems. So that's, I think, our particular interest in this area. I've been really inspired by this meeting, and it's made me think as well about the importance of oracy for those most vulnerable children as well, because they are sadly some of the children who most often need to advocate for themselves. The child in front of the magistrate explaining why they did what they did, the child on a child protection plan explaining what it feels like to live with domestic abuse, the child in care saying why they want to live with their own foster care. Of course, it's our duty and responsibility as professionals, as advocates for them, to seek out their voices and to make sure that their views and feelings are heard. But I think it's made me feel how powerful oracy could be for those children, to help them, to empower them to speak up for themselves and make it harder to overlook them and have things done to them. As one child said to us, she just felt like a parcel being passed around in care, and to empower them to feel that they have a voice and a say. I think oracy is be a wonderful thing in that respect. Just coming back to the speech and language things, I will very quickly run over our findings, which is that we're really worried about the fact that we found over half of areas have seen a real terms reduction in spend on speech and language therapy over the last 2 years, and there's huge variation sort of across different areas, from more than £16 per child in some to less than 50p per child in others. It's deeply shocking and concerning. And I think what we've been really worried about is that there's no central collection of this spend going on. So we went out and literally asked every local authority and clinical commissioning group to provide that information to us. We have been trying to work with Public Health England and others to keep monitoring on that. They are unfortunately quite busy at the moment with other things, but we think to have that accountability for speech and language spending is so important, to be able, people like all of yourselves, to kind of keep track of it and keep an eye on it. So I think that would be one of our really important calls around this, would be that is able to be monitored. And just a final very quick remark on the early years. I think that, as others said, this is such an important time for parental involvement, but it's pretty complicated at the moment, the way systems work to support parents. There's lots of health checks, there's education checks. we're not great yet at integrating between health and education. I think people often feel they're bouncing, particularly with communication and speech, bounce between health professionals, education professionals, who often have slightly different ways of talking about things, as we've all discussed already. There's some really good work going on around developing a speech and language pathway for health visitors. I think work like that gives us all a common way of supporting parents around this is really important. I think that's as condensed as I can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was super condensed, and I know we're slightly over time, so I'm just going to ask for like 1 minute or less comments from each of the panelists, and I'm going to invite Lord Watson as well to just give a 1 minute comment, if that's okay. So if I can, I was going to go back to the very president, Becky, but she's had to leave. So if I can ask Jean just for a quick sort of 1 minute summary comment on what we've heard today. Thank you.
My comment is being aware of all the people out there, the audience, if you like. So many different skills, and I think what we really need to do is bring together the Oracy movement with the Teaching English as a Foreign Language movement, with the EAL movement in schools, and with those organisations that support children with speech, language and communication needs, in a joint effort to do three things: to define together what children need to learn, second, define together what do teachers need to know in order to teach that, and third, what does good practice look like if you put in a school, what good school would meet all those needs well, but to do it together.
Brilliant, a great sense of unity. Thank you very much. Roy Blatchford, could I have your final thoughts and comments?
Just unmuting. Enjoying all of the messages. Thanks everybody who's participated in this. I guess I'd go back to say, we've got no Ofsted, no written exams, no league tables, no SATs, no Progress 8 measures, gone in a sweep. So let's not waste that opportunity to review how we assess and examine early years, 11 plus, 16 plus, and in so doing, place Oracy at the heart of all subjects.
Brilliant, thank you. Sonia, final thoughts and comments, please.
Yes, thank you. So I think the emphasis should be on working with parents and carers, the relationship with the home, the way in which we access education, the way that technology is going to be used. I think that we need to, I agree with Roy and Jean with their summary, but I think we also need to look at how we're going to deliver this, and that has to be in partnership, and to have that mutuality with all parents, regardless of their background, challenge and needs. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And Alice, your final thoughts?
I can be very succinct, and to coin a phrase, I agree with Roy.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Harriet, would you like to make any final observations?
That's fine, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Lord Watson, Mike, would you like to make any comments?
Yes, thank you. Well, I've learned so much in the last hour and a half. It's been hugely valuable. I certainly take on board the fact that a relationship with parents and carers is key to this, but I think teachers as well, an issue that I was going to raise if I had the time. Roy spoke about the Forgotten Third report, which I think was 2017. And one of the recommendations there was that from September of this year, all primary and secondary teachers' training programs should include courses on teaching of reading, writing and oracy. I don't know, but I suspect not much progress has been made towards that. So I like his view that we should not waste the crisis, that we've not quite gone to year zero, but that many things are changing or will change, and that we have to use that as a basis. And I think trying to ensure that teachers are as well prepared as they can be, and not for much longer will Roy be able to say articulacy is not a word for many teachers.
Sorry, Mike, I'm just interrupting 1 second because I've got to go and vote. So I'm going to probably, because it's now going to take us half an hour because we've got to queue for over a kilometre. So I'm just going to say a quick goodbye, but sorry to interrupt you then, Mike. See you later.
I was literally finishing anyway, so thanks, Emma.
Thank you, everyone. I think Emma's just had to run off there to vote, so I think we've come to the conclusion of our session anyway. I'd just like to thank all our panellists for being here today. We've had fantastic evidence from you all. It's been incredibly valuable for the inquiry. We're going to take this all the way with us. We're going to have some forthcoming sessions on other themes as well, which I hope you can all join. For audience watching, you know, please do think about submitting evidence yourselves. We have a survey on our website, oracyappg.org.uk. There's more information there about how you can get involved and have your say, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions. So big thank you to our panellists for today, especially for being patient, as I know we've run over, and thank you everybody.